So, welcome to Virtual Futures Salon, and for those of you who are here for the first time, the Virtual Futures Conference occurred at the University of Warwick in the mid-90s. And to quote its co-founder, it arose at a tipping point in the technologization of first world cultures. Now, whilst it was most often portrayed as a techno-positivist festival of accelerationism towards a post-human future, the Glastonbury of cyberculture, as The Guardian put it, its actual aim, hidden behind the brush steel, the silicon, the jargon, the designer drugs, and charismatic prophets, was much more sober and much more urgent. What Virtual Futures did was try to cast a critical eye over how humans and non-humans engage with emerging scientific theory and technological development. The Salon series completes the conference's aim to bury the 20th century and begin work on the 21st. So, let's begin. And let's begin with a video clip.
I got it.
Of course you got it.
And that's the way it was. Each day I would dispose of as much loose skin, fingernails, and hair as possible to limit how much of my invalid self I would leave in the valid world. At the same time, Eugene prepared samples of his own superior body matter so that I might pass for him. Customized urine pouches for the frequent substance tests, fingertip blood sachets for security checks, and vials filled with other traces. While Eugene supplied me with a new identity, I paid the rent and kept him in the style to which he'd become accustomed. Eugene never suffered from the routine discrimination of a utero, a faith birth, or invalid, as we were called. A valid, a vitro, a made man. He suffered under a different burden, the burden of perfection. I was now a member of a relatively new and particularly detested segment of society. One of those who refuses to play the hand that he was dealt. I am most commonly known as a borrowed ladder, or a degenerate.
So the 1997 film GATTACA depicts a not-too-distant biopunk future driven by eugenics. Children are genetically manipulated at birth to ensure they possess the best hereditary traits. The result is a society rife with genetic discrimination, or genoism, where an individual's socio-economic class is defined by their genetic makeup. Today, scientists are already altering DNA to make crops more resistant to extreme weather conditions and to prevent disease in animals. But the ability to genetically modify humans provokes new concerns. It feels like we are ever closer to reality whereby genome editing technology could be used to modify human embryos. Now, doing so could eradicate certain hereditary diseases such as cancers or debilitating Huntington's disease, but even though the aim is to reduce human suffering, we still don't know the long-term effects and impacts of these forms of modification. And who is to say that we'll stop there? Why wouldn't we use these tools not only to cure, but also enhance? And enhance qualities like beauty or strength or intelligence. All of this draws us closer to the future portrayed in GATTACA and raises new ethical concerns. Tonight, we'll question what happens when science fiction fast becomes potential reality. And together with my incredible panelists, we will question how DNA is forcing us to rethink what it means to be human in the 21st century. And I want to start with Dr. Sarah Chan, who's the Chancellor's Fellow at the Usher Institute of Population Health Sciences and Informatics at the University of Edinburgh. And Sarah, the question I want to ask you is what is a film like GATTACA warning us about? And how does it contain those common arguments related to this thing called genome editing?
So in today's world of genome editing, genetic testing, whole genome sequencing, I get asked a lot about genetic modification, and people often bring up GATTACA actually as an example of a dystopic geneticized future. And I'll usually respond by saying, you know, these are not new issues. Actually, we have been talking about genetic modification for approximately 40-odd years, since the 70s and the era of recombinant DNA. So I think it's interesting to put this film, 1997, 20 years ago, into that historical context, which was 20 years after those concerns first arose. So if we think about what's happening at the time that GATTACA was being made, we have the Human Genome Project underway. Dolly the sheep was born a year or so later. So it's interesting to look at where we are now, 20 years after that, and think also about where we might be 20 years further in the future. GATTACA, as Luke said, is set in the not-too-distant future. Those words actually come up somewhere on the screen. Has everyone seen GATTACA, by the way? I hope so. Otherwise, otherwise you might be in for a confusing hour and a half. So the words actually come up in the not-too-distant future. And this always reminds me of what's the other famous film that begins with a setting about a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. So there's a real contrast there between the fantasy world versus the dystopic almost reality. And I think what's interesting is that GATTACA frames all of the issues that are coming up within the debate. What are the first things people ask me about designer babies? Is gene editing, is genetic modification going to lead to a world of designer babies? And sure enough, we see the parents at the genetic counsellor choosing the hair, the eye, the skin colour, all stereotypical characteristics of designer babies. Discrimination. Whether people will be discriminated against on the basis of their genes. Vincent talks about the creation of a new underclass and the fact that with genetic technologies, we now have discrimination down to a science. Max Mellman, of course, refers to the worry about the development of a genetic underclass where the haves become the gene rich, to use Lee Silver's term. And, of course, the quote that we just heard about how much of my invalid self would I leave in the valid world calls to mind references to Huxley's Brave New World. The concern about depersonalization, the loss of identity and individuality in which we're reduced to nothing but our genes or biology. So Vincent, when he assumes Eugene's identity, is not worried that he'll be recognized because when was the last time anyone looked at a photograph? They only have to look at your DNA. He talks about, in his transformation, the last day that I'll be me. And when his secret identity is at risk of being discovered by Irene, the love interest in the film, you don't know who he is, do you? I don't even know who you are anymore. When we don't know our genes, we don't know ourselves, is the message that comes across very strongly there. It also raises questions about the way in which genome editing or genetic manipulation, so they didn't have genome editing back then, no one had heard of the term, but the way in which genetic manipulation and genetic technologies might change the world around us and the ways in which we live. So consider, for example, our questions about what will happen to love, marriage, reproduction in a geneticized world. They used to say a child conceived in love was lucky. They don't say that anymore because, of course, you can't choose the genes of a child conceived that way. So the idea of playing the genetic lottery and whether or not we're wise to do that is very much invoked there. In the scene where they're choosing the child's characteristics, the father says, well, we thought, wouldn't it be good to leave some things to chance? And the genetic counsellor says, why would you want to do that? Why would we want to leave it to chance? What will happen to the law, to forensics and to the criminal law? So in the scene in which they're looking for the criminal who's committed the violent murder within the organisation, they look at people's genes and say, his profile suggests a violent temperament. Or the director who, okay, no spoilers because you've all seen it, the director who actually turns out to be the culprit says, take another look at my genes and my genetic profile. You won't find a violent bone in my body. So what happens to the law? What happens to sports? Eugene was picked to be an athlete, but what happens when the child picked to be the athlete is second on the podium? So it brings to mind all of these questions. Now, what's interesting to me is that 20 years on, we still, in many ways, haven't moved on from this debate. So in the work that I'm doing with publics around genetic technologies, I am hearing back these same sorts of arguments. What this says to me is that publics have engaged with and have responded to and have picked up the elements of the discourse that we've covered within bioethics. We're hearing these arguments now. Where are the new arguments? I think that we need to move on. For the next 20 years, we don't need to go back over the same territory that GATTACA's taken us through, over the territory we covered with Asilomar back in the 70s. We need new sorts of arguments, new ways of addressing the technologies that we're confronted with, and I hope that's what we're going to open up tonight.
So, Professor Andy Meir, I want to turn to you. You're the chair in science communication and future media at Salford University, and really this panel was your idea. You brought this panel to us. You look, it's 20 years of GATTACA, and I think it's an important historical and important cultural artifact. And why is that?
Well, I guess to start off is I personalize film experiences greatly. I love this film. I think it was a wonderful way of dealing with complex scientific, ethical problems, moral dilemmas, and as you said at the start, questions about what it is that defines the species. And one of the overarching narratives of this kind of falls into this idea that we don't quite know what defines us. So if you think back to the moment when the two brothers are swimming and where we have this competition between the invalid, which I think is interesting as a term in the film even, because even I remember growing up where the term invalid was still sort of used, but the intonation invalid, of course, changes it quite considerably. But where we have these two brothers swimming and where the genetically perfect one can't understand how his brother, with those supposedly inferior genes, is able to just to keep going. And it comes down to him saying, he tells him that he wasn't saving anything for the swim back. And in that moment, you kind of realize, well, there's something more than genes that's going on here. There is something about will and motivation and psychology that's happening. And perhaps the genes don't tell us enough about what we need to perfect in order to even have a fully formed definition of perfection. And for me, that's been central to many of these discussions over this 20 years, which it's funny how this came out about the same time as Virtual Futures was happening, at the same time the Human Genome Project was happening, at the same time commentators around the world. There's one very well-known book around 1995 published called From Chance to Choice, which is a key book in bioethics debates about these sorts of things. And it sort of crystallized the predicament. And when thinking about how you personalize your kind of film experiences and how you take from them and think, what would I do if I could do this? I mean, that for me is crucial. The burden within this film is the burden of choice and this sense of expectation that in that genetic counselor meeting, of course you're going to eliminate baldness or tendencies to things that are antisocial in some way. Of course you would do that. This is already quite interesting because if you think back about the last 10 or 20 years of ideas about genetic counselling and what that might look like, the idea that the genetic counsellor would actually kind of encourage you to do one thing or another is actually quite troubling, and especially if it's something that was sort of sociologically defined rather than sort of health related, it's really challenging. So this really sort of created this future, I think, where it alerted us to the risks of a kind of runaway individualism where we think just, well, let's just do everything and leave nothing to chance at all. So that seemed really quite profound at that particular time. And I remember actually just a year after the film came out, a lot of my work has been looking at genetics in sport. And the first article I read related to that was in the magazine New Scientist, and it was about the idea of a performance gene. And it suggested that we could select specific genes and optimize them for different kinds of performances. And after that, so we had like a decade and a half of all sorts of studies that tried to identify performance genes, essentially endurance or power-based genes, and associate those with different kinds of capacities in sport. And the world of sports kind of got up in arms about this. It spent 15 years trying to think about detecting possible modifications of genes, and it still is. So the film occurred at a point in which these were becoming practical realities, if not reliable or safe, but just simply sociological realities. In 2004, a company put out a genetic test that you could then use with your kids and figure out whether they're going to be an endurance athlete or a sprint athlete. So these were actual realities that were emerging after this film. And I think for that reason, it's sort of still important because it helps us thinking about what that world would be like and what things matter to us. And as much, just to finish up one thing, I guess that you remember the scene when you have the pianist who has 6 fingers on each hand. And the proposition here is that with that capacity, with the additional 2 fingers, they can compose and play all sorts of wonderful, wonderful things that wouldn't be possible with just 5. And I suppose that's also the allure of the film, is that it does sort of get us into this idea of the unknown and the sort of unimaginable possibilities that enhancement could bring.
So I want to turn to Guinness Taylor, and you are a postdoctoral training fellow in the Lovell Bridge Lab at the Francis Crick Institute in London. And for you, these aren't science fictional nascent possibilities. These are technologies that you're living with and working with every single day. And I just wonder, since the science behind genetic engineering is so often misunderstood, could you give us the lay of the land of where we are right now today with this form of technology?
Okay, of course, Nick. So to explain about genetic engineering or genome engineering technologies, the first thing I have to do, I'm afraid, is give you a very basic biology lesson or reminder. So I'm sorry to do this to you on a Wednesday evening. It is Wednesday, isn't it?
Yeah, that's
okay. Excellent.
Halloween was last night. A lot of people are suffering.
Yeah. Right. So the basic premise of life is we all started off life as a single cell with effectively a single instruction manual for how to go from being one cell to being a whole human being the size that you are with the characteristics that you are, made up of many, many millions of cells. So this instruction manual is often sort of envisaged as being about 23 or 24 sort of volumes, okay? And if you imagine this as a stack of books, this will help with the sort of analogy. This instruction manual tells your cell, your singular cell, your existence at the beginning point of life, how to divide into 2, how to divide into 4 from that point, how to continue growing, how to become look like a baby, how to grow into a child, how to develop through your entire life, and how to run every single organ in your body that is running at present. So as you can imagine, that's quite a lot of instructions and quite a varied amount of instructions as well. And so where genome engineering technologies comes in is, there have been various generations of technologies, as are generations of iPhone, for example, with newer and newer innovations, and they get better and better and more effective at what you want them to do. So when scientists do experiments to try and work out how life works, how does a heart muscle beat? How does a testicle become a testicle, in my case? We need to ask questions about how particular portions of that manual work. How does a single gene telling the cell to make a singular protein work? Consequently, we've had to develop tools to try and remove this gene. So imagine you have your 23 volumes, and it's the effective, it used to be, at least the technologies used to be as crude as, well, if I remove a couple of pages out of this book that vaguely also contain the part that I'm interested in, what happens to that cell? That's the sort of idea of a lot of research. So what happens if you remove it? Equally, we like to do experiments where we put that gene into a cell that perhaps didn't used to have it before. So what happens to this type of cell if I give it an instruction to make whatever protein of interest that I have, okay? This is how we sort of try and get an idea of how life works. So genome technologies, genome engineering technologies have been pretty crude. In the last couple of years, there's been this advent of a technology that you may or may not have heard of called CRISPR-Cas9. It's a bit of a mouthful. But essentially, the reason why this has sort of rekindled the debate on genome technologies, or genome engineering technologies, I should say, is because it is the newest version of these technologies and therefore is significantly more accurate. So to go back to the analogy of the books, this is now the equivalent of suggesting, thanks to the Human Genome Project, we have a digital version of the sort of series volumes of books that we have. And the CRISPR-Cas9 is effectively like using a find function in Word or PDF, whatever you want to use. And then we can do things such as replace. So scientists like myself, like to use this technology, for example, to be more specific. So now, rather than ripping out whole pages of this manual effectively, we can specifically find the section that we're interested in. If you imagine a whole page as a gene, because genes make proteins which are quite large, so they're quite expansive often. But very excitingly, a lot of human diseases that we study can actually be caused by single, effectively, letter changes. So by changing a single letter on effectively a page, you can completely invalidate the entire protein. So this technology allows scientists like myself and my colleagues to actually direct sort of a molecular pair of scissors is what it's sort of often sort of painted as. But a protein to go to this particular location and to induce changes. And of course, that means that as a technology, it's very helpful to us to do research, to ask better and better questions about things that we're interested in. Now, to link back to what Andy said, for example, talking about a performance gene. Now, from our understanding of biology, and even your understanding of performance, if you think back to the day in school that you best ever did in a sports event, right? What was it that changed that day? It wasn't your genetic code, right? Like, you've always been the same. There's lots of other things that are going on. Maybe you ate something that helped improve your performance or whatever. And so the idea of creating a perfect human being with enhanced performance, right, isn't just a matter of finding a singular gene, a singular page in that 23-volume book, right? There's a lot of different things that have to be tweaked. And actually, we don't know what any of those things are, mostly, actually. So a lot of the traits that we talk about, especially beauty and perfection and cognitive ability and performance and grit and intellect, many of these things are not confined to a single page, effectively, not to a single position, not to a single page, not even to a single volume. And so actually the biggest power in this genome engineering technologies is the fact that scientists can use it to better understand us, to better forward our understanding and deepen our understanding, and therefore be able to then also later on potentially apply this. And the last thing I'm going to say on this, because I'm probably beginning to run out of time, is the fact that whilst, yes, we have this technology now, and that does technically mean it is very easy to do in a lab. I could probably take one of you guys to my lab, and in 2 weeks' time, we could change the DNA in whatever organism I wanted to do. Ballpark. Yeah. So it is easy. There is reason for why this has become incredibly pressing at this point in time. And I've completely lost my train of thought by trying to think, how many of you guys could I apply to my projects of interest? But yes, the thing to say is really, whilst this technology is very accessible at the moment and very pertinent, most of the human applications at the moment, and when I say most of the human applications, occur either in cells that are outside of the body. And I don't know if you guys will have heard recently, of course, the first case of using CRISPR-Cas9 in human embryos did occur recently. Last month, a paper came out. Some of you might have heard about it in the news. The thing to remember in all of these sorts of headlines is actually it's being used for research purposes. These are not embryos that are going to be put back into humans. We're not at that stage yet, mostly because we don't know yet. We have the human genome, but we don't actually know what all of the pages account for, what they work, how they work, and how each of the little parts that we are increasingly learning about lead to increased probabilities rather than certainties a lot of the time. So I think on that note, I'm going to let you continue, Luke.
So, I mean, all of that sounds wonderfully egalitarian, but Dr. Dave King, you're the founder of Human Genetics Alert, and you have a great deal of concerns regarding these technologies. And in fact, you've called for a global ban on the genetic engineering of people. Could you tell us why?
Sure. I'm going to slightly change the narrative here from science fiction to what's actually happening in the real world. And the story that eugenics, which is what we're talking about here, people know what eugenics is, yeah? was this kind of horrible thing that happened, in America and Nazi Germany and led to the Holocaust and all that. But then it all stopped in 1945, and maybe it might happen in the future. That story is an ideologically constructed history that suits the interest of geneticists, basically. The truth is that eugenics never went away. I could give you a dozen examples of the way it's actually happening right here, right now in our society and in other parts of the world. And I'll just give you one for an example. In the USA, they have a commercial market in donor eggs, i.e. for women who need eggs in order to conceive through IVF. So, and a paid market, i.e. if you're an egg donor, you get maybe $5,000 if you're an ordinary working class woman. But if you're a Harvard, if you're at an Ivy League university and you're tall and athletic and beautiful, you get $50,000 for your eggs. So there's an example of basically the logic of the free market and the logic of eugenics, that you basically pay more for a superior product, are precisely the same logic. So I don't think we have to speculate wildly about what would happen if these technologies get loose in our existing world. We already know that there's markets for so-called enhancement. I always put the word enhancement in single quotes, because when you look at what the things are that are supposedly better, they are nearly always to do with either conforming to existing prejudices in our society, sexism, ageism, racism. If you think of the way cosmetic surgery is used, it's all about that. We know that there are markets for so-called enhancement, that people start off their careers wanting to, help humanity through science, and end up, doing cosmetic surgery and making millions. And we see that with drugs, we see it with surgery, we see it with information technology. And I think genetic engineering of human beings can create a potentially much more powerful form of eugenics. And I think that's completely predictable. We don't have to, indulge in wild speculations there. And that's why I called for a global legal ban, as a lot of other people have done. In fact, we already have international and national law on that because of the experience of eugenics. Governments decided to ban the genetic modification of human beings. And that's a fairly extraordinary thing when you think about it, in a world where the whole climate is about innovation. Technology is wonderful. They're the only things really that we would ban 20 years before they were technologically feasible are basically weapons of mass destruction. That's the only analogy. And I would argue that genetic engineering of human beings is a weapon of mass social destruction, really. So I will be. There's already a campaign going, including Gunesh's boss's boss, Robin Lovell Badge, to overturn those legal bans. So I will be campaigning, certainly, to make sure that those bans stay, which is a kind of weird position for me as a radical lefty nutter, to be supporting the decisions made by the world's governments. Okay, so I think I'll just say a few words, if I've got time, about why this would be an extremely bad thing. I mean, I think the film shows you. Very well why it would be an extremely bad thing. I think one thing it doesn't point out is, of course, that these technologies will be expensive. Rich people will be able to give their children extra advantages over other people's children. Is that a world you want your children to live in? I think, and we have to bear in mind, it's not just about individuals, it's not about individual struggles as you get in, of course, romantic Hollywood films. Genetics is also about groups, and I think you only have to look at what happens in large parts of Asia, using rather low-tech means to basically allow prejudices like sexism to decide which kind of people get born. So we have more than 100 million women missing in the world who should be here, but have been selected out prior to birth or killed shortly after birth. Simply because they're female. So you know, do we want to start? Do we want to start letting those prejudices loose with and empowering them with genetic technology? I don't think so. I think the term designer babies, of course, is about a slightly different aspect of it. It's about the idea of designing our children just like any other consumer commodity. You know, I want this specification and this specification and this specification. I want it in pink, please. No, that's not the way you relate to your children. That's not the way you should relate to your children. I think once you start turning children into commodities, that's the end of humanism. That's the end of the notion that human beings have a special status, have, you know, and need a special kind of respect in the world. So I think all of these things, and of course, you know, if you think about that kind of world and how easy it would be to be like me, a disabled person, you know, I think you can see it wouldn't be too easy. So I'll stop there, I think. But yeah, these are, you know, these things, given the way the world is, these things are pretty predictable. We often get told, oh, the benefits of genetic engineering are very concrete, and it's these wild speculations about the nasty things that would happen. It's the other way round. Actually, the medical benefits are actually negligible because we already have the technology to prevent disability, to prevent serious genetic impairments. But the social consequences are really palpable and obvious and will be really hard to avoid.
So before we have a response to that, and I'm sure there's strong responses to that sort of opinion, I want to turn to Professor Eilish Wood, who's a professor of film studies at the University of Kent, and whether it's fears or possibilities that are captured by these technologies, we always find, and especially with the Virtual Futures audience, we always find the framing of science fiction or fiction to be very useful to frame our engagement with techno-science. And I just wonder your thoughts on how we're perceiving the world of science and technology through film.
Okay. Well, I'm going to primarily answer that in relation to GATTACA. Yeah. So science fiction, whether as novels, games, animation or films, always has the leeway to try out ideas, to to speculate and to play at the possibilities of things. A phrase often used in relation to science fiction, as probably most of you already know, is extrapolation. Science fiction takes something happening in the era of its making and extrapolates it often into the future, pushing and exaggerating those ideas. So in the 1990s, genetic engineering was already in the popular imagination through films like Jurassic Park. Which came out at the same time, of course, when there was an increasing awareness that these technologies, genetic engineering and cloning, were also part of emerging as science as well. Now, placing GATTACA a little bit more in its 1990s context, which some people have already touched on, the Human Genome Project, set up to completely sequence the human genome, was 7 years into its 15-year program. And across the decade, the 90s, sequencing of the genome was associated with fears of commercial exploitation of the data by large companies, while at the same time around optimism about the therapeutic opportunities that might emerge. In the year before GATTACA's release in 1996, Dolly the sheep was born. And as the first cloned, or the first successfully cloned animal, opened up the ways in which the possibility of cloning humans might occur, something which had already been imagined in films like Blade Runner and perhaps a less well-known film, Multiplicity. I don't know if any of you have seen Multiplicity. No. It's a Michael Keaton film. Anyway, preparing for this event, moving swiftly on from that film, preparing for this event, I revisited some of the features that were released in association with GATTACA. One of the marketing team on the film described how, as part of the advertising strategy, the filmmakers advertised a phone number of a fictitious lab. which was a biotesting lab which could advise people on how to genetically manipulate their children. And apparently this lab got thousands of calls. So we can see already the debate pulling in two directions. We have the anxieties about monsters and ethics, and at the same time, we have people buying into the idea that they can get ahead, or their children can get ahead with genetic manipulation. So that's the context of the film. So I'm just going to now move on to look more directly at the film itself. Within the story world of GATTACA, genetic engineering creates profiles that define what people can and cannot do. And our hero Vincent is the figure who's meant to show us that the human spirit isn't defined only by genetic makeup, but from something else, such as the determination to succeed, or will, I think, as you mentioned earlier. Vincent stands against the system, or maybe it's more accurate to say that he infiltrates the system, showing up its reliance on code alone to be ill-founded. Now, the coldness of the system is also visible on screen in the environment in which the characters live and work. And so Jerome's home, where both Vincent and Jerome live, has no softness. It's very clinical, it's full of chrome, and we saw a clip of that right at the beginning of the event. It's full of chrome equipment for maintaining the illusion of Vincent as Jerome. It has hard wooden surfaces and a helical staircase echoing the shape of DNA. Outside the apartment is hard-edged too, with concrete walkways and hard sunlight. The GATTACA Institute, where Jerome fakes his identity, is again full of cool symmetry that reduces individuals to groups of suits on walkways, arrays of workers at computers. At the same time, frequent long takes and slow push-ins, and the score by Michael Nyman brings a slow and, I think, quite contemplative elegance to the film. So GATTACA then pushes into its foreground a connection between genetic engineering and fears about exploitative and discriminatory practices, introducing words like genoism and degenerates. Another of the features associated with the film reveals that the film was originally going to have an added-on ending, with the sequence highlighting in how in 1997, we were entering an era in which we could soon control our evolution. And had we been able to do so sooner in our history, perhaps people such as Abraham Lincoln, Albert Einstein, this is obviously an American film, Abraham Lincoln, Emily Dickinson, Vincent van Gogh, Rita Hayworth, Ray Charles, Jackie Joyner Kersee might never have been born. Now, even without this ending, I think GATTACA's position that controlling evolution from genetic engineering is a bad idea is quite clear. So GATTACA, like many science fiction films, imagines the best and the worst. Its dreams and nightmares of controlling the world, ourselves and our bodies, was of a moment in the later 1990s. And so, where have we come to in the last 20 years? I think we've expanded the question into TV and games, and series such as Orphan Black and games like BioShock joined the X-Men franchise, Prometheus and its sequel, and we have Never Let Me Go and also Blade Runner 2049. Now, I think many of these films remain caught up with the genetically determined future as something where exercising control is paramount, whether in the all-conquering heroes of the X-Men or resisting threatening mutations in BioShock. Now, looking across these films, I wonder, though, whether there are signs that we're slowly, very slowly moving on. Blade Runner 2049, and I hope this isn't a spoiler for anyone who hasn't seen the film, Blade Runner 2049, Orphan Black, and maybe Prometheus 2 have stories in which genetically determined entities escape the system. The unexpected creatures of these fictions aren't monsters, dinosaurs or piranhas or rabid mutants running amok, but human or human-like beings with hopes and fears and frailties that are much more like us. Now, I'm not sure what this adds up to. This is only a handful of films after all. But I think we're moving beyond that kind of tried and tested monster narrative to beginning to think about these issues are about us. They're not about monsters, they're about the impact on us.
So with that note of reflection as to whether what's being expressed in these films is fundamentally about something very, very human, whether you stand on the side of Gattaca being this kind of dystopian fiction or perhaps utopian fiction, the one thing that emerges from that film is this thing called genetic determinism, or whether you've called it the something else or the will. And I just wonder whether that term genetic determinism itself can be proved valid, or perhaps that term itself is invalid. And Sarah, I want to turn to you on that point.
Okay, so so Dave has said the film shows us why using these genetic technologies would be a bad thing. And a lot of people do read Gattaca as a cautionary tale about genetic manipulation. And I'm going to say, no, it's not. It's a cautionary tale about genetic determinism, which is what Luke's just brought up. So the problem in Gattaca is that the world of Gattaca believes that we are ruled by our genes. And the key moment in the film, that moment of the swim that Andy mentioned, is the moment in which we realize that fate is not entirely determined by our genes. It's the moment that makes everything possible. And this idea that we can read your future in your DNA, that we can determine what you're allowed to be, what you can be, what you're not allowed to be by your genes, is this idea that Luke referred to as genetic determinism. And I think it's incredibly corrosive, and I think it's scientifically not founded. So what I'm going to say is, we've brought out the big guns here with the use of the term eugenics, but is eugenics politics or is it science? Of course, it's both, but by focusing on the science as the culprit, we let the politics off the hook. In saying that we're going to create the perfect babies by making the perfect genome, we completely ignore the role of all of the other factors that make us who we are, the will, the determination, not the determinism. We ignore the role of the human spirit, and we ignore the social norms that shape our ideas about who's allowed to be who. Now, what is there a market for? Okay, maybe these days of the free market, it would lead to a eugenic, 6-foot-tall, Harvard, blonde-haired, blue-eyed basketball player. But is the problem eugenics or the free market and the social norms that drive it? And again, I'm going to say it's the social norms and the free market. Now look, that people may use or are using genetic technologies to reify social prejudices is a bad thing. I don't disagree about that at all. But those prejudices are already with us. The problem of missing women is not just due to sex selection or sex-selective abortion. It's also due to female infanticide. That's not a genetic technology. And the problem here is that as long as we have the convenient bugaboo of genetic engineering to point the finger at and say, look, it's because of genetic technology, we don't have to do anything then about those social prejudices. We can be complacent and say, we're on the side of right, we're against eugenics, but these problems are already here. Genetics, genetic technologies are not the problem here.
But Ganesh, you're not doing consumer eugenics at the Francis Crick Institute, and you're not driving towards the homogeneity of humanity, are you? You're doing something more scientifically interesting.
Yeah. So there's a couple of things to say. So yes, absolutely, you're right. I use genome engineering to address questions of biology, blue skies research. That's what most people who use genome engineering technologies at the moment are using it for, at least in this country. We can't account for everybody else. But the thing that I just wanted to say is actually the dictionary definition of eugenics, I'm going to read it out, is the science of improving the population by controlling breeding to increase the occurrence of desirable heritable characteristics. Just for the record, it doesn't say anything about everyone has to be 6'2", blonde-haired and blue-eyed, which leads me on to the next thing, right? The point is, imagine for a second, we actually could do all of these things that people keep talking about, which we can't, for the record. But if we could, and the entire planet was told from tomorrow onwards, we're all going to be doing IVF, and everyone can pick whatever characteristics they want for their children, because everyone wants the best for their children, and we can do that now magically, like this tomorrow, would we actually all come to some sort of agreement tomorrow on what the perfect human being would be. I mean, I highly doubt it, right? I mean, this is just my personal opinion here, but I can't imagine any one of us on this panel even picking the same characteristics for our children. And so this idea of like this loss of variety, this loss of this sort of occurrence of homogeneity, this sort of sameness thing, I think it's just an irrational fear. Sure, trends are a thing, just like, you know, clothes come and go and trends happen. I'm not going to say that perhaps that couldn't be an occurrence. But everyone does have different opinions on what is perfect, what they would want for their children. And so I think that sort of also relates to this other point that came out of what you guys were saying, which is there's always this like sadness of like, oh, imagine if so-and-so hadn't been born. And somehow as if using a genetic technology to improve the next generation is invalidating their existence. And that's not actually the case at all. No one's saying you aren't worthy of whatever it is you achieved in your life. It's an aspiration, right? It's about imagine what these people could be like. And absolutely like Sarah said, I mean, when I watched Gattaca, and again, this is a completely personal thing, what I took away from that is probably a reflection of my understanding of biology anyway, which is biology is the foundation from which we all grow. Of course, it does provide you with instructions for how your body is built, right? Which has some implications on your propensities and inclinations potentially in life. But it doesn't tell you what you're going to experience in your life, what lessons you're going to learn from the other people that you interact with. It's not going to tell you what the society that you've grown up in with and how to deal with that. And in the end, what it, you know, to me, the film says, the human spirit, the human will, the drive, that in sort of unfathomable thing that leads to this invalid in the film, completely bypassing the whole system, having an aspiration and achieving something with his life is the most positive thing. When in the light of this genetic determinism, the secondary character thinks, well, my genes supposedly guaranteed my life and it hasn't happened, so I might as well end it now. You know, I think that's really important. I've completely forgotten what you asked me, but yeah.
But Dave, to that point, do you think your fear, and question whether fear is the right word, but do you think your concern perhaps is less about the biotechnology itself and more of the societal effect of biotechnology? Are you worried that people are going to be seen as products, or that we're going to enforce cultural evolution, i.e. trends, onto biological evolution?
Okay, a couple of things. What you've just heard is an attempt to reassure you it'll all be fine. Right. First thing, I should say, I have a PhD in molecular biology. I don't need to be given lectures on the pitfalls of genetic determinism. I've actually organised public campaigns on those issues. I've written lots of articles about it. And it's interesting that this story, oh, we can't do it anyway because genetics is much too complex. I find it an interesting disjunction between the narratives that we get about the power of genes and genetics when scientists are writing their grant applications or when they're writing their press releases after their latest paper, and what the wonders that they're going to do with all of this, and the narrative that they put forward when they want to reassure you about the claims of people like me. There's a big difference there. I think a very crucial thing that Sarah said is, oh, the problem is not the science, it's the politics. And it's that dichotomy, that mental dichotomy that we're all brought up with in liberal society. We're all brought up to think that science is neutral and value-free and objective. And if there's problems to do with that to do with science, it's because bad people abuse it. Of course, that narrative serves science very nicely. But the truth of the matter is that there is an ideology of science. There's an ideology which has been the mainstream ideology of our society for the last 400 years, which basically says that freedom and progress comes through the control of nature through technology. That's the central religious myth. And by the way, I use that word religious quite literally. If you read David Noble's book on the religion of technology, he traces how that comes through from the Christian ideas of transcendence of the fallen condition of man after the Garden of Eden and Eve eating the apple. That in the Middle Ages there emerged a current of theological thought which culminated in the scientific revolution, which said we can recreate the state of grace that existed prior to the fall through perfecting nature with technology. And we're in the transhumanist movement, you see this very kind of clearly, totally blatantly, explicitly. This is what they're talking about. Those religious ideas are there all the time, are still very much with us. But technocracy, I mean, Eilish, I think tellingly said, all of these, these super beings, it's about control. And indeed, that is correct. That is what it's all about. It's about control of nature. And in here, we're talking about the extension of that technocratic drive to control nature that we see in industrial agriculture, for example, to human beings and to the control of human nature. So you can't split those two, science and politics, and say, the problem's all with the politics and the bad people. No, science, is the central ideology of our society, and that ideology of control is what that film is about.
But Andy, there are bioethical frameworks in place to stop some of the things that Dave is talking about, are there not?
Well, there are, Luke, but I want to take a sidestep if I could.
Well, why don't you?
We can come back to that in a moment.
Right.
But I would like to propose that the debate, whether we do or don't pursue this, isn't actually the core of the film at all. The core of the film is about biological kinship. And that's born in the relationship between the two brothers, in that swim back. It's not about whether one version is better than the other. It's about that relationship between the two and the fact that even though they are biologically different, there is a profound sense of responsibility, love, friendship that binds them together. The same would be true of Jerome and Vincent, where we have this sharing of biology, literally kind of wearing his biology. And so for me, the film is much more powerfully about those relationships and the fact that in a world where we can engineer things, that doesn't mean that we set up this distinction between the haves or the gene rich, as Sarah, I think, mentioned, and the gene poor. And these sorts of debates often focus on, because there is a practical implication to this, if we allow something to take place, then something else will follow from that. And it might be a series of trends. And I remember reading a long time ago that the amount of money that goes into the development of any pharmaceutical product is half the amount that's put into the marketing of it. And, I must confess that when I do go to the US and watch television and see commercials about healthcare, I'm frightened by it because it is I think a reduction of the value of healthcare and what healthcare should entail. So we're right to be anxious about the subjugation of this sort of science to a range of commercial, political aspirations. But I also kind of optimistic that we can devise a different system. I don't believe that this rolling out will be that some can have it and some can't. I think as of healthcare, broadly speaking, everyone benefits from it being available to everyone on equal measure. And I would say the same with genetics.
Do you think we need to devise, Eilish, perhaps a new narrative, or cinema at least needs to develop a new narrative? Has there been a lack of imagination in cinema when it comes to thinking about things such as biotechnology in the last, say, 5 years?
Yeah, I think so. I think the complex relationships between what happens in laboratories, what gets funded in laboratories, how people develop narratives around science and technology, both in science, both in popular culture. Within cinema, within games, and within animation, seems to be really limited to good scientists, bad scientists, monsters. There's kind of there's a few exceptions, but there's very little in terms of exceptions. So I think the debates in certainly the films that I was mentioning, that they're very narrow. they don't answer the sorts of questions that you're trying to pick up on. Because they are much more driven quite often by an action scenario where somebody wants to win. I also think one of the interesting things about, just picking up on Andy's point about the relationship between the brothers, which is an interesting reading of the film, but I also think that GATTACA is a very contradictory film in many ways, because Jerome, or rather Vincent, he uses all of the opportunities that he has to, make use of Jerome's body to infiltrate a system and then go with that system. So he actually doesn't challenge any of the kind of framework within the system that privileges a certain kind of genetic determinism, I suppose. And I also think that's something that's really contradictory about the film. On the one hand, we celebrate him, we celebrate the relationship in a way between Vincent and Jerome, and you could almost say that Jerome loves Vincent. He gives up his life for him. He sacrifices himself in order so Jerome can go through. But Jerome becomes a suit. He goes to the moon. And I've always kind of pondered that. And that's not to kind of say that the friendship between the brothers is really important. I guess it's kind of, say, typical of popular cinema, that there are different ways of making readings of the film.
I just want to, not just, when it comes to this debate, not just poor aesthetics in cinema when it comes to biotechnology, but are we also stuck not with just the same narratives, but with the same language? So, Sarah, you said in your opening statements that we're kind of caught with these phrases when we talk about the genetic modification of humans. We're caught with the phrase genetic lottery or playing God or designer babies, and these are historical terms, and yet it doesn't feel like the debate's gone any further from the fascination and the obsession with these very scary things.
I feel that we are using loaded terms to hide behind, if you like. I mean, I pointed the finger at eugenics as one such. Designer babies is another. What about things like human dignity or the genome of humanity? When we hear arguments about the sanctity of the genome of humanity invoked, well, we know that the genome is changing all the time. I go out in the sun, I am hit by UV rays, there are changes in my genome. So I feel like a lot of the time we're using linguistic metaphors to conveniently package up ideas that we really need to actually unpack and take a look at. Another one that I hear coming up a lot that was very prevalent around the time GATTACA was made was this idea of the human genome as the book of life. Now, of course, we know that I think metaphors about genomes as books are really useful for helping us understand, but the book of life is not the be-all and end-all. The analogy, I suppose, is with a Bible or some holy book that tells us everything about how the world should be. But the Bible can be written in different languages. It can be corrupted. It can be read by different people and interpreted. In fact, the whole idea of hermeneutics, reading the book in different ways. And we're starting to understand, Gunesh is probably the best person to talk about this, but we're starting to understand that if we want to call the genome a book, there are so many different ways in which to read it, that to fetishize, if you like, the actual sequence of letters, the words in the book, if you like, above all of the other factors is really quite misleading.
Is there an issue of looking at the human as a reductionist process when it comes to biotechnology? The fact that you can sort of reduce them to this code, and the code being a metaphor in itself, it's not information really, is it? Is it DNA? DNA is something other than just pure play information.
What?
Sorry.
Sorry.
Let me answer a question in a different way. I think so. With regards to CRISPR-Cas9, so we look at this. We take a human individual and we reduce them to information technologies. So the Human Genome Project basically revealed to us that we are a series of letters in a sequence, and that kind of sparks a certain rethinking and recognizing of the human. And now with things like CRISPR-Cas9, we can rewrite our informational sequence. I mean, we're not reducible to the same sort of processes that happen inside of computers, and I think there is a translation issue there. We think we're going to edit this like we edit software or virtual avatars.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so I think the fear comes in with this belief that somehow, because DNA is information to your cells for how to build your body, that by changing that somehow you change who you are as a human being, as who we are as humankind, actually. And I think that that's a very important distinction to make. So yes, you are to some extent what your DNA is, because that defines the physical limits within which you exist. Your DNA does not tell you what thoughts to have in the sense of like actual you are thinking now. That's not happening because DNA is being reorganized for you to have this thought. And so I think consequently people do get quite upset about it. And this argument about the control of nature using technology, I'm going to put this out there. I think actually to be human is to control nature using technology. I'm not being funny. We're in a building with electricity and gas and heating and clothing. And this is, I mean, I know, and I understand, you know, whether or, this is an argument obviously that comes up, right? Because to people like me, it seems blazingly obvious that this is what we're doing and this is the sort of conclusion, basically, of what we've been working towards as biologists, right? What do we want to know? We want to know how biology works. How do we do that? We look at DNA, and once you do that, you want to be able to test that, to be able to rearrange these things. But somehow to think that simply by using a technology, we are going to completely dehumanize us, as Sarah said, kind of absolves the responsibility from all of us to actually stop and think about this, which I think is actually what this whole debate is about, right? It's not just about, you know, do we use the technology, yes or no? Because I hate to break it to you, it's being used, it's developed, it's out there already, and it is being used everywhere, all over the planet. Not necessarily for humans. We don't think it's being used for humans currently, but it could be, right? So the point is, it's there. So now we have to decide what we're going to do about it. And that completely falls actually within the realms of societal debate, actually, telling scientists, yes, you can, no, you can't, legislation and all such things. So it's for us to decide amongst ourselves, actually, do you feel like you are just a string of letters? Are you defined by that? And if so, then maybe you shouldn't, you know, support the use of genetic technologies. But we all need to come to some sort of consensus amongst ourselves about that before we can really have a debate about this stuff, I think.
So, Sarah, how do we make better informed decisions with regards to this form of technology?
Well, so I don't want to say which are the better decisions to make. That's something we do have to decide through public consensus. But I think it is our responsibility to take those choices on. So, okay, so it is a bit of a straw man to say that I'm completely separating science and politics. Of course, science has political elements, but the ideology of science with which we're grappling now, this idea of control of nature, is not necessarily the same as the ideology that says a certain bodily form, 6 foot whatever, is the better way to be. So I think it's important to realise that those are not necessarily the same thing. So you can't wrap all politics into one any more than you can completely dissociate science from politics. When it comes to talking about control, as Gunesh said, taking control is agency. Agency is what defines us as humans. We are moral agents. We are capable of understanding the world and of changing it, and of understanding that we can change it, and therefore we have responsibility for that decision. Now, who wouldn't want to have control? I was in Mexico very recently, just 2 days after the big earthquake in Mexico City. If we could control nature well enough to have better predicted that so that 40 buildings didn't collapse and hundreds of people didn't die, wouldn't that be the morally better thing to do? I can't see any way in which abandoning control is a good thing there. Abandoning control isn't morally praiseworthy or responsible. Imagine if you're in a car and the driver says, I'm taking my hands off the wheel. If we think that's a good idea, well, I'm not getting in a car with anyone who thinks giving up control.
You've never been in a Tesla.
Oh, well, we're entering into different territory there. But the point here is that the burden of choice that is given us with these technologies is that we need to take responsibility about how we use them. And simply saying we give up control isn't responsible. To me, one of the most powerful scenes in the film is actually the one towards the end of the film where Jerome climbs that spiral staircase hand over hand because he's paralyzed in order to help Vincent fulfill his destiny. And that can be read, I think, in two ways. One is the really simple sense of we as humans are exerting our power over DNA, because the spiral staircase, right, is the metaphor for DNA. So it could be read in a sense of, well, we've gained control over DNA, or it could be read as we are gaining control over the metaphor. We are understanding its limitations. We are understanding both our power and our lack of power, and the fact that DNA doesn't control us. We may control it to some extent, but that is controlling the world and controlling our nature is far, far more than that.
So Dave, what is wrong with a little bit more agency?
There's nothing wrong with a little bit more agency, but I mean, I use that term, the control of nature, as a shorthand for a vast body of scholarly work about this, you know. How, at the beginning of the 21st century, when we are faced with environmental crisis as a result of 200 years of technocratic industrialism, and capitalism, of course, when we're enmeshed in a system of total surveillance of us through technologies, you know, when we are facing a new form of eugenics, you can't tell that there might be something wrong and problematic with that idea of, not merely the idea, the total ideology of control over nature as the route to freedom and progress. I don't know what world you're living in. It's not to say, of course, I take medicine, of course. It's not that control of nature is wrong per se. Of course not. But the point is that the ideology that emerged with the scientific revolution is the ideology of control of nature without limit, without restraint, without cultural, social, religious restraint. Read Cavalier Merchant's The Death of Nature if you want to know the details. I really have to pick up on this science and politics thing. The idea that of the control of nature and the 6'2" human, 6'2" blonde, athlete is the perfect human being. You said those are two completely different things.
I didn't say
they're completely
different. I said they're not necessarily linked.
Okay, I say they're necessarily linked. Actually, the ideology of control of nature through technology is the ideology of basically of the functionally most efficient and powerful entity is allowed to dominate the rest. That's basically what it is. That's what technocracy is about. So we've had 400 years of invention of machines which become more and more powerful, and so we're at the point where artificial intelligence is about to make our employment redundant, and in fact, almost all of our functions redundant, because the artificial intelligence and the machines are functionally more powerful than we are. That's technocracy for you, and that's what we've got to look at. And the thing about blonde giants, the Nazi ideology was all about, the fascist ideology is all about the functionally most powerful entity shall be allowed to dominate the rest of the world. So I'm afraid it is the same. It's the same idea.
Andy, there's frameworks in place to stop the sort of tyranny of the technocracy that Dave's talking about. Are there not?
Thanks for coming to me, Luke, for that.
Good luck, Andy.
Well, I want to tell you about one thing. About 10 years ago, there was a case of a basketball player in the US called Ed Curry, who moved to a club that then required him to take a genetic test for a gene associated with sudden death related to head trauma. And this has come up in boxing as well as something that perhaps all boxers should have in order to be allowed to be kind of medically signed off to take part in the sport. The relevance to something like basketball is certainly more contested, but nevertheless, here we have an example whereby a presumed determinative genetic test would be used as a correlative sort of mechanism to determine risk associated with a practice like sport. So, okay, he might not get the injury, he might not die from it if it happened, but the basis on which a decision is made about whether someone can do it is a probabilistic decision. And I think the worry is that in a world where genetic tests are used in that way to determine what people are allowed to do because there's a risk associated with it, which has a monetary value, is in fact something to be worried about, not least because we see this being rolled out in cases like Ed Curry. And in his case, he decided not to go to that basketball club and go to another one. So we have to be, but the message for me here is actually not that these things are worrisome, but that actually there's much more work to be done in the regulation of these technologies. And in fact, that goes back to then what sort of world we want to live in. And I really wonder what you mean by per se when you say I'm not against medical stuff per se, because it seems to me that the entire project of Western medicine is a pushing back against any kind of disease, or in fact, to begin to treat the concept of aging as a disease. So if you commit to modifying yourself sort of as you're alive, you have the potential also to actually extend your life as a result. And so there's nothing more troubling about doing that than simply taking your pill. And I think equally, if you think about the pill that you take for whatever condition you have, the medical regulations around the prescription of it, the amount that you're allowed to take, are reasonably robust. So I think it's worth being optimistic that we could similarly imagine a system that allows us to use this responsibly.
Do you think there's irresponsibility within the world of cinema, Alish, when we see these sorts of technologies taken to the extreme, what we get is what we've had in cinema over the last at least 10 years, which is the superhero movie, the Marvel and DC universes that kind of now aestheticize and fetishize this sort of extreme bettering of self through mutation?
So the first statement you made in that question was, what was the first part of the question?
With regards to the way in which we're engaging with some of this technology is through superhero films.
Okay.
They've been very popular in the last sort of 10 to 5 years, and it seems to be the narrative through which young children are experiencing their first engagement with this sort of technology. Pokemon I've always thought was an example of a massive advert for biological chimeras built in a lab.
Yeah.
Like that little guinea pig thing with the weird turtle back.
Yeah. You started out with cinema. Was it being irresponsible? Wasn't it? Yeah. Cool. Well, is cinema being irresponsible?
People working in cinema are being irresponsible. We know that.
Yeah. Well, I think you can always find both positives and negatives in these films. They are, on the one hand, kind of amazing examples of people's imagination, fantasies of what might be, different sorts of powers. What if I could do this? They are kind of mediations on that. They're also examples of what people can do with digital technologies, how they can create different kinds of narrative spaces, how they can use and work with actors' performance in all sorts of different ways. And some of that is shown in very, spectacular ways. It's the essence of a Marvel film. At the same time, it has running through it always these contradictory politics. You can't get away from the contradictory politics in these films. It does go back to the figure of the superhero and the person who can destroy the enemy. Then you end up in a kind of series of questions about representation, about what kind of figure is a superhero. It kind of goes back to what you were saying before about what is the, what do we value in terms of humanity? And that's something that just pervades the whole of cinema. That's not just about superhero films. Or heroes in cinema are always, subject to problems around representation, whether it's gender or race or sexuality. Popular cinema, it's very conflicted. There are things you can find as positives, but there are many things that you can find as negatives. And usually the films don't work those things out. They're much more interested in, a Marvel adventure is about ensuring the Marvel universe goes on and that, we'll get the next franchise, we'll get the next comic, we'll play the next game. That's what they're aiming for. They're not looking to solve complex problems.
So the people who may be able to solve our complex problems might be this audience. And we have about 20 minutes for audience questions. Luke, if you could bring up the lights, and also a wonderful alumni member, Graham Haladonso, is going to run a mic. I am struggling to see hands, but I think there's one in the middle just here.
Can I say something while that's happening?
Yeah, please.
I don't want to let this go because I think there's some philosophical sleight of hand happening on the other side of the stage here, which goes in the form, all A's are B, therefore all B's are A. Now, it is true that the ideology that might have prompted Nazi eugenics perhaps saw itself as deriving from the whole Enlightenment history of control of nature, but that doesn't mean that all science that goes on is driven by that or has to fulfill that ideology. I think there's a huge amount of difference between control of nature and that then being co-opted and corrupted to control of people, which is exactly what Nazi eugenics did and which we don't want to do. I think where science is used to facilitate people's own choices over their lives, that's actually a good thing. And you can't say that that is the same ideology. Or to put it another way, the Nazis might have all thought they were scientists, but not all scientists are Nazis. True or not, Gunesh?
Exactly. So I was going to say, there seems to also be this idea that somehow scientists are off in the corner doing their thing, generating this super species and whatever. And admittedly, I have just told you we are off in our corner tinkering away with this stuff. But the point is, society gets to decide what happens. Like, we all do that together, and scientists are part of that. And science is not just some entity that exists outside of society that occasionally rocks up and says, right, guys, this is what's happening. People have to adopt these things, you know. Mini discs, they never took off. Well, imagine the poor souls who invented that.
Graham, just here.
Hi, well, thank you for the great debate. Really enjoyed it. I wanted to comment on something that Professor Wood said about the fake lab website. I'm actually a co-founder of Bento Lab, which is a sort of laboratory that's laptop size you can take anywhere. And we're part of a kind of global movement of trying to make some of these tools actually more accessible. So, in fact, there are even CRISPR kits that you can buy even if you're not a scientist, and do some stuff by yourself. So I think that's also good to be aware of these things. Of obviously, these movements aren't just in institutes, but also there are lots of other people who want to take part in this, whether it's hype or hope for them. I'm not going to answer that. I wanted to ask two questions. One to Dr. King, which is about. I mean, I understand you want this whole technology banned. I'm curious, what conditions would have to be fulfilled for you to not want it banned, or for you to say, actually, I think now we're ready as a society or as humans to have this technology? And vice versa, I'd like to ask Ganesh, is there an example of something or a condition you can think of that would lead you to support such a ban? Some set of scenarios where you think actually maybe it is better to have a moratorium on this technology because of this example or this condition. Thank you.
Let's start with Dave.
Okay, so this technology is already banned, as I pointed out, rather extraordinarily. 20 years before it was technically feasible, all the governments of all the industrialized countries of the world decided to ban it. And you have to think there's got to be a good overriding reason for doing that. What conditions would I allow this to happen? There is no medical need for it. As I mentioned, we already have the technology to prevent the birth of children with severe genetic impairments. So there's absolutely no need to do genetic modification. So there's no medical case for it. So you're asking really the question about, when would I allow it for enhancement? The very far future, after the revolution, basically. After the revolution, we can think about ways in which we can do this that are not within the technocratic drive to control nature and are not about empowering existing prejudices like racism and sexism. But for now, just keep it in the box.
Yeah, okay. I mean, just to hark back to the what if, so if we'd have had genome engineering before, we would never have had Van Gogh and all these things you've just said, you'd be all right with terminating embryos. I mean, talk about eugenics at its basis. If you want to have that discussion. Anyway.
Listen, as a disabled person, give me some credit for having thought about that issue very seriously, please. I'll give you all the very short version. Indeed, the representative organisations of disabled people around the world have for a very long time had clear positions against prenatal testing and termination of pregnancy on the basis of disability, because they regard it as a continuation of eugenics. And I have a great deal of sympathy for that. However, I basically agree with the disability rights argument that disability is caused by social causes, lack of access, prejudice, etc. Impairment is the physical difference. So I'm basically completely support that position, but you have to say there are some really severe genetic conditions where the child is born, with in extreme pain, with an extremely short lifespan, where the families maybe already had a child like that already, where it makes absolute sense to allow parents to make that choice. And in that situation, if we have that technology to do that, that doesn't mean that I want that technology to proliferate and to be used in more and more widely, as indeed is the trend, is one of the eugenic tendencies going on in the world today. I think we have to keep that under control, but genetic engineering would make the whole thing far, far worse.
Okay, cool. So it's an enhancement thing that you particularly object to. To answer the question from the bento box guy, sorry, I don't remember your name, if you introduce yourself. So what would it require for me to support a ban of genome engineering technologies being used? Well, there is regulation already. So technically, as a person who adheres to such things, I am already in coherence in keeping with such bans. Do I think it's possible to actually ban it? Is actually the question I'd like to answer, which is no. No, I don't think it's possible to ban it. It's not possible. It might be possible to ban it in this country. I don't understand how anyone thinks that once this sort of technology has already been released into the world, that we can somehow retract it and even come to the belief that every society on this planet is in keeping with our belief that somehow it should be kept under wraps. I think we're past that point, I'm afraid, of being able to say, let's ban this thing. We're at the point at which we actually have to think about what kind of society do we want? What is it to be a human being? How much regulation do we want to put into place to deal with this technology that already exists? So that's that. But on top of that, of course, as a basic researcher, again, I'm going to say this, I envisage a future where we use this technology to answer our scientific questions way before we go anywhere near human beings to do this stuff. So I alluded to it before, the recent news reports about CRISPR-Cas9 in human embryos. Again, it's not just human embryos we found on the streets. This is sort of surplus to requirement IVF embryos that have been donated to science to answer a scientific question. This is not babies that are being edited to have superpowers, as every single child that I've talked to about this stuff seems to want to have. I mean, this is basic research. This is us trying to understand what is it actually that's going on in our genomes, because as any literary scholars in this room might understand, it's one thing to be able to read a book cover to cover, and it's another thing to really understand it. And that's sort of where we're at.
Any other questions at all?
Yeah. I'm a child of the 20th century, the generation which Luke rather alarmingly said we were here to bury this evening.
So the concepts of, not the people from. Although sometimes I do have a... Anyway, go on.
I'd just like to speak to Dr. King, because my generation theoretically should be the people who are most alarmed by the scientific advances that are now taking place and the consequences of GATTACA and so on. But Dr. King has convinced me entirely otherwise. And I would like to say to Dr. King, I have no expectation of changing your beliefs anyway, but I would like you to reconsider or review at least some of the statements that you've made. Firstly, our species has practiced eugenics for getting on for 200,000 years. Eugenics, selective breeding for the betterment of the race. Every one of us, every time we, for instance, have a sexual relationship, we are intending, we hope, for some eugenics. We want better children than ourselves. Now, we may all disagree, and in fact, we clearly have done across history about what a better race looks like, because we're a pretty diverse bunch out here. But nevertheless, eugenics, in the sense of the making human lives better, is a basic human principle, and we have always acted on that. We have done everything we can to do that. Eradicating smallpox, just for instance. Okay, we've done everything we can to improve. We now have tools that allow us to make some particular modifications. And the thing you haven't done, Dr. King, to me, is distinguish between what I would call proper eugenics, for instance, the elimination of certain inherited diseases, and enhancement. And you haven't made that distinction properly to me. I have a friend who died of motor neurone disease. Like smallpox, I look forward to the decade when there is no motor neurone disease in the human race. And I think that's now possible. It's on the horizon. But that's completely different to the idea of human enhancement and agreement about what the human race ought to look like, because we're never going to agree about that. So that's one thing I really would like you to review what you're saying about it. And the second thing is, as I think Ganesh will confirm, CRISPR-Cas9 is such a simple and such a cheap technology that it is out there. It is freely available. Almost anybody can do it in their home now. And certainly will be doing it right around the world in the next few years and decades. And the question is not about whether it's possible or what. It's what do we do with these technologies? What is the proper framework? What are the regulations that should govern these things? And I do think, Dr. King, that you really aren't helping the debate by just saying blanket ban, end.
So before Dave replies, and there's an applause at the front there. Before Dave replies to that, Andy, I want to turn to you on that word enhancement. So are we still caught in the end of the 80s, mid-90s ideas of enhancement, the morphological freedom that Max Moore talks about, where it's going to be better or faster or stronger? Or do you think at the turn of the 21st century, we're a little bit more mature when we think about this thing called enhancement? It's not about being better, but it's about embracing, encouraging, and engineering more difference, and making the sorts of decisions ourselves as individuals of what sort of difference we want over our lives.
Well, I do think that we have often limited ourselves in terms of imagining the possibilities. And to give you one example, which I must admit isn't necessarily the best example, but I think it's interesting, a small project called the North Sense that was launched a couple of years ago. And it's essentially an implant technology. You locate it on your chest. Looking at it, it looks like essentially a kind of piercing, but it's a kind of appendage, and you have it there permanently. And what it will do is it will tell you when you're facing north. It gives you a sense of direction that perhaps we don't... I mean, getting here with Google Maps, it said, follow the street north. I thought, OK, which way is that? And I guess what they're trying to do there is two things. One is to reconnect us with the sense of direction that perhaps we had in a pre-technological age, but also to invite us to consider other facilities that we might have that other species have as well. So in my concern is that we often kind of restrict this argument to those things we've seen in the past where there have been trends that may be troubling in terms of society, so the preference of one gender over another, the way in which the kind of industry of cosmetic surgery leans towards a certain notion of beauty. Those are, I think, appropriate concerns to have. But I think that we have to work with people like our bento box friend at the back there to access the range of imaginations that are out that could actually inform this possible future. And unless we really do that, unless we do democratize technology in the fullest sense, I think we limit the discussion considerably. And I think that's a key part of this for me.
You mean you didn't read the stars?
I didn't know, no.
I want to go to a quick question here.
Yeah. Thank you so much, all of you. It's a very enlightening evening. And Dave King as well. I think you've opted into an evening where there's a lot of self-selection for people against your position. So thank you for being here. I think this is for everyone, but especially Ganesh Teller. You know, the Human Genome Project, which was mentioned, was deemed a failure because it was budgeted for 15 years, and after 7.5, they'd only found 1% of the genome. And so many people expected it to take a century. It ended up being completed before time. You jokingly said, oh, it's not going to happen tomorrow. We all know that. But when do you think it's going to happen that we can actually make significant changes? And I know that's a big request. From a practical standpoint, because something like CRISPR-Cas9 is obviously a huge leap forward in terms of effectiveness and efficiency.
Okay, you mean in terms of when could I, theoretically, if I wanted to genetically modify a human embryo, when could I do that? Theoretically tomorrow. Theoretically tomorrow. Would it be viable? Would I have picked the right target? Would it definitely work the first time? Would I be allowed to implant it? Would it survive? Would it grow to be a normal human being? Those are all questions that we don't know, but tomorrow, yeah.
In terms of the sort of science fiction perspective that we've seen, where you could effectively go in and say, let's enhance intelligence, let's enhance...
No. So I've tried to impress this upon you guys. There are certain things that we know, right, factually. If you have an extra chromosome 21, you have Down syndrome. We know certain facts, right? There's a lot of things that we don't know yet about what is happening in our genetic code. And a lot of the characteristics that we sort of obsess about, the things that we find most desirable, actually, that we talk about in this sort of eugenics side of the debate, are things that we don't really understand fully yet. And that's why I keep trying to draw this distinction between what we can apply, because we know it to be true, and when we use the technology to know better, to understand better, to improve our information, which of course then eventually feeds back potentially into these things. So I could imagine a future where we might know what it takes to increase the odds of having improved cognitive ability. But we're back to the probabilistic thing. It's all about probabilities. As we know this to be true, even if you look at, it sounds really odd actually, this has just popped into my head. We know that human beings that grow up in forests only encountering wolves don't tend to be winning Nobel Prizes or even be able to speak. Clearly, it is not just in our ability to have cells with a certain code in it to be able to become human. In my definition of what is to be a human, because simply a form, an existence is not it, by my understanding of humanity. I hope that addresses that.
I'm going to say the question right up the back on that table there. Graham, you can run that. Where are we going to read it? All the way back? Yep, straight at the back on that table of 20th century people. All right, okay, whatever.
Hi, thanks for the debate tonight. I've noticed that there's a lot of tension between kind of the two sides of the stage up here. And it makes for a great debate and a performance. But I do think that this idea of kind of the fear of what could happen and the fact that we're still talking about these questions 20 years after this film was made, 40 years after the technology was first available, how do we engage people who maybe are afraid of this and continue to have a conversation where it's not just about the other and the people who are informed about the truth of the science? And what does that conversation look like?
And I want to take your question and go down the line of panelists, starting with Dave. How do we engage people more sensitively to these issues?
I'll come to that. I guess I need to answer the question that was asked specifically of me.
In interest of time, because Andy's got a train, but in interest of time, to that question specifically, how do we engage individuals outside of this audience and outside of this panel?
I guess I'd answer that by saying we need a more sophisticated understanding of the politics of technology, one that does not rely on the notion that science is value-free and objective, and that, in fact, it has its own politics that hugely influences our society. I will just say, I didn't say all scientists are Nazis. I don't like being accused of philosophical sleight of hand. What I will say is that's the problem. If all scientists were Nazis, it would be easy to see what's going on, right? The problem is they're also bloody well-meaning, and they want to help. The problem is their conceptions of what helping is.
And Elish, what do we need to see within film or aesthetics to help us have better narratives for these issues?
Right. Within film, I guess a story that finds a way of explaining a little bit more about what science is and does. I think that's a rarity, probably because how do you turn it into dramatic fiction, which is what cinema is all about. Way back when that story of the double helix, the Rosalind Franklin story, was made, that was turned into a really interesting drama, and it did tell you stuff about science. But I think fiction films probably aren't really the place to tell that story. There are some fantastic things called molecular movies, which explain the kind of basics of cellular metabolism, explain what scientists do, and I think we need more of that information in the general population to actually understand what it is that people are doing, and then you can have debates about the ethics and the possibilities of what those kinds of experiments do. But I'm not sure cinema is really the place to do that.
And Sarah, how do we better communicate outside of this very curated audience this evening, these sorts of issues?
I think the public's actually doing a pretty good job of engaging with these issues. Some of the work that I'm involved in with the Royal Society and engaging with publics on genetic technology shows people are primed to talk about these things, to engage. My friends up the back will be happy to hear that I'm actually in agreement with Dave on this. I think we do need more attention to politics inside and outside of science, and less jargon, less loaded terms. People are willing to get to grips with the real issues, so let's not hide behind terminology anymore.
And Andy, the same to you.
Yeah, so I guess the thing I would say is that over the last 25 years, we've seen a rise in engagement, certainly, with things like science festivals, science centres, and even debates like this. I think the proliferation of meetups where we have these conversations is crucial. At the same time, we shouldn't underestimate the millions of people that see films and the conversations they have afterwards. The term that's used a lot in these circles at the moment is the development of science capital. And the anxiety is that if we just kind of hit people incrementally or sort of informal ways, it's not enough. We need to engage people and make them feel part of the development of science. And without that, we just kind of exclude them from the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think we're probably all aware of the fact that there's been this slightly more trendy scientific presence that's started appearing on our screens with things like Big Bang Theory and such like even. And the fact that actually I think there is actually a place for these sorts of Marvel-style movies. Whenever I go talk to secondary school kids about genome engineering, the moment you tell them that you can do this, the first thing they always ask is, "Oh, does that mean I can learn to fly? Can I get wings? Can I do this stuff?" And even though it's not actually what's possible, the point is it stokes the imagination, it gets people engaged. My personal opinion, evidently, is the fact that I think it's important that scientists get out there and talk to others. But I think also those that talk to scientists or even have a conversation amongst themselves, not featuring scientists, just questions about it, are more open to discussing these kinds of things. And that's where my reticence about the word eugenics actually really comes in. I think it massively shuts down the conversation. If the second you bring up the fact that we could change people's DNA leads to someone telling you that you're a fascist or you're a Nazi, that's not particularly healthy for conversation, and more conversation needs to be had. And these things will not just feed into our conversations about science. Actually, the biggest thing that I've taken away from this debate is the fact that we all pretty much agree. It's not the science, right? It's how do we all want to engage with the science? What societal changes do we see supporting that? How do we want to build our society? That's actually the question, right? Not science, yes or no.
So let's walk away from 2 E words and towards 3 E words. Maybe it's not about enhancement or eugenics, but maybe it's about embracing, encouraging, and engineering difference. And on that note, if you haven't noticed already, we have Dot1 joining us today. So Dot1 is a company that uses consumer genetic code to create DNA personalized prints. There's a table just here, and I do encourage you to check it out. In the next few weeks, they'll be launching their own DNA kits for UK customers just in time for Christmas. This isn't sponsored. I just think it's really cool. And go talk to her. Where's Iona? She run away? Wave higher. There we go. So she's doing some awesome stuff. Go check out her work here. And on that note, I want to thank the Hospital Club for making this happen, with a special thanks to Jeffrey J. and to Luke Aziz at the back, who does a wonderful job at making us sound great. And to Graham Haladonso, who isn't just our mic runner, who's an incredible cyborg artist, has been incredibly supportive of the work we do at Virtual Futures, and to our wonderful filmmaker, who allows us to make this content freely available on YouTube under Creative Commons. And if you like what we do, please support us on Patreon and find out about Virtual Futures at Virtual Futures pretty much anywhere on the web. And I want to end with this, which is how we end every single Virtual Futures, and it is with a warning. Because the future is always virtual, and some things that may seem imminent or inevitable never actually happen. Fortunately, our ability to survive the future isn't predicated on our capacity for prediction. Although, and in those much more rare occasions, something remarkable does come of staring the future deep in the eyes and challenging everything that it seems to promise. I hope you feel you've done that tonight. Please join me in thanking these incredible panelists. The bar is now open.
Go, go, go.